We continue here, Masech Psachim, Paraches, Mishnah Vav. Ha'oinen v'mefakeach es hagal, v'chein mi sheftichu lo yitzir mi beis asurim, v'achoyle v'hazokin shen yechoylem lechel kazayas sheichten aleim. The Mishnah discusses the halacha of certain people whose situation on Erev Pesach calls into question whether they'll be able to eat the Korban Pesach that night or not. So ha'oinen is somebody whose close relative died that day, who midrabanan is also to eat korbanos the night after the relative's death. Midaraisa, it's a machlekes, it's a big shmuz in the Gemara, but upon the death of anyone's 7 closest relatives, a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter, or a spouse, a person enters a state called aninus, which lasts until burial, and is known as an oinen. An oinen is also midaraisa to eat from korbanos until nightfall of the day on which the death occurred. Midrabanon, this extends to the night after the death as well, even if the relative was buried during that day. The Mishnah here speaks of an oinen who did not become tameh from the corpse of the relative. Had he become tameh, who would remain tameh for at least 7 days and would not be eligible to eat the Korban Pesach that night. V'amfakeach es hagal, as well as somebody removing a pile of rubble on top of a trapped person who, if the person is dead, becomes tameh meis. A building collapsed on top of a person and trapped him. Rescuers are trying to reach him by pulling off the rubble. If the victim is dead, the rescuers become tameh. Even if the rescuers didn't touch the tumah, they may have leaned over it, which would make them tameh because of probably some type of tumas oil. And so too, someone whose jailers promised to release him from prison by the night of Pesach, or ill person, or an old person who was capable of eating a kezayis of basar despite his weakness, sheichten aleim. The halacha is in all these cases that we may shech the korban pesach on their behalf. Since the issur for an oinen to eat the basar of korbanos at night is only midrabanon, the rabbanon waives their issur for the sake of allowing him to eat the korban pesach, which is a deraisa. This is because the mitzvah of achilas korban pesach, or the hakravas ha-pesach, is extremely strict, which is one of the only 2 mitzvahs aseh that actually has a chiv kares attached to it. Since the person removing the rubble does not know whether the victim was dead, we assume him to be tahor and allow him to eat the korban pesach. This is based on chazaka, which tells us to assume in cases of a suffix that a person's status has not changed, so because he wasn't tameh before, he won't be tameh now either. And in the case of the prisoner, we assume that the jailers will keep their word and release him in time to eat the Korban Pesach. In the case of the sick and the elderly, we assume that they'll remain well enough to eat a kezayis of B'sar Pesach that evening. Al kulon ein shechted aleim b'fnei atzmon. However, for all of these, we do not shecht on their behalf as a group by themselves, shami yaviu as a Pesach lidei psul, because we are concerned that they might cause the meat of the Korban Pesach to be disqualified by leaving it uneaten, should it turn out that all of them are unable to eat it that night. For an example, an oinen in his grief might forget that he needs to eat the Korban Pesach that night and touch or lean over the body of the dead relative, becoming tameh. And even if the relative was buried before the Korban Pesach was shechted, we're concerned that the oinen might not be able to eat anything due to his tsar and his avelos. The rescue worker that's removing the rubble might find out that he's tameh. If it turns out the person underneath it was dead, the prisoner might not be released, and the older sick person might become weaker by nighttime and be unable to eat the required amount of meat to be ate to the chiv of Korban Pesach. Therefore, they must join a group that includes others, in the worst case that other people could eat the meat. Therefore, since if at the time of the hakrava, since at the time the carbon was shechted and the blood was placed on the mizbeach, those people were expected to be able to eat it, it becomes a disqualification of the kind we fear happened to them afterwards, and it turns out that they cannot eat the Korban Pesach. P'tur milasas Pesach Sheni, they're parted from making a Pesach Sheni. Once a person's Korban Pesach once they were makriv the Korban Pesach, he's ready to his chiyuv of bringing a Korban Pesach, even if he ends up not eating any of it. Since these people were allowed to make a Korban Pesach, they're to their chiyuv. Except for the one removing the rubble, who, if the person buried under it turns out to be dead, he might not eat the Korban Pesach that night, since we see that he was tameh from the start, meaning from before he shechted the Korban Pesach, he was never eligible to have the Korban Pesach brought for him. Although at the time the Korban Pesach was shechted, we didn't know whether the victim was dead or alive. If we discover later in the day or evening that he was indeed dead, then it turns out that the rescuer became tamei as soon as he began pulling rubble off the pile. It's thus clear that he was tamei at the time his Korban Pesach was shechted. This applies only if the rubble pile was narrow. So as soon as he began to removing it, he may have leaned over the body and became tamei. But if the pile was spread out, it's possible that he didn't lean over the body by the time the Korban Pesach was shechted. He would not bring a Korban Pesach sheni. Mishnah Zayin. Ein shechten es a Pesach ala yochid. You may not shech the Korban Pesach for an individual if there's only one person registered on it. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Azezak Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda learns this out from a pasuk that you may not shech the Korban Pesach in one of your cities. He learns in one, but achad she'oracho, to refer to a group consisting of only one person. Rabbi Yosi Mati, Rabbi Yosi permitted. Why? Rabbi Yosi bases this on a pasuk said in regard to registering people on the Korban Pesach, each man according to what he eats, which implies that even a single person is allowed to make his own chabura. Afilu chabura shal me'ah she'en yichol lechel kezayis, ein shechten aleim. Even if there's a group of 100 people that includes someone who cannot eat a kezayis of basar at Pesach, we may not shech the Korban Pesach for him. Rabbi Yosi means to stress that the number of people in the group doesn't matter. The important thing is that each member of the group must be able to eat at least a kezayis. Similarly, we may not form a group consisting of only men and avodim, eved kananis, or ketanim, because the eved kananim might behave immorally with the women or minors. It's acceptable to have a group of slaves alone or women alone, but we cannot have a mixed group of slaves and women or slaves and children, since a group eats the Korban Pesach together, as we learned in Parak Zayin, and leaving the Eved alone with the women or with the children might lead to immoral behavior between them, which is always a chashash of avodim, because Mishum Pritzusa, and just to read the Rav, is Ein Oisen Chaburis, Nashim Avodim Lishchet Pesach, Nashim Avodim Bachabura Achas, Mishum Hergel Aveira, like Tan Avodim Chur Achas, Mishum Pritzusa, the Mishkav Zohar. There's a chashash of Mishkav Zohar by these avodim. Av Nashim Avodim Kol Chod B'Apen Avshe Oisen. Nashim, you can make a chabura of just Nashim. Avodim, you can make a whole chabura of just Nashim. Mishnah Ches. Oinein Toivel Lo'ichlas Pischei L'Erev. In Mishnah Vav we learned that you may shech the Korban Pesach for people who are not eligible to eat from the Korban on that day, if they will be able to eat from the Korban that night. The Mishnah now discusses this halacha in regard to other Korbanos. The Mishnah will be mechalek in certain cases between the Korban Pesach and other Korbanos. So Oinein Toivel Lo'ichlas Pischei L'Erev. Oinein, what we spoke about in Mishnah Vav, immerses himself in a mikvah on Erev Pesach and eats his Korban Pesach that evening. But an Oinen may not eat from the other Korbanos on the night after a close relative's death because of it Issa D'Rabbanan. The Chachamim extended the halacha of Oinen to the night after the Misa as well. But the Chachamim waived the Isser only for the sake of Korban Pesach, since it's a mitzvah that carries a Chi of Kares, so they didn't want to, they loy omdu b'makom Kares. Somebody who hears about a relative that just passed away, he hears his relative died sometime before today, or someone who's having his parents' bones gathered for reburial, both of whom have the rabbinic status of an oinen on that day. In the times of the Mishnah, it was common for people to bury the dead in moist earth until the body decomposed, and then gather the bones and rebury them in a drier family plot. On the day the bones are gathered, the living relative is considered like an avel. So Taival Veichel Bakachim, he's Taival himself in a mikvah, and he may eat from all the Korbanos on the following night, since even during that day his status of Aninus was only Midrabbanan. The Rabbanan did not extend the Isser on the following night. The Mishnah refers to someone whose parents' bones are being gathered by others. If he gathers them himself, he becomes Tamei for 7 days by touching the bones, and may definitely not eat any of the Korbanos that night. And here comes another famous Mishnah, Gershon is Guy Erev Pesach. Someone converted to Yiddishkeit on Erev Pesach. He was circumcised for the purpose of his gerus that day. So Beishamai Oimrim, Taival Va'ichlas Pischei L'Erev. Beishamai say he's Taival himself in a mikveh that day to complete the gerus process, and he may eat his Korban Pesach that night. A person who wishes to convert to Judaism must undergo both circumcision, in the case of a man, and immersion in a mikveh. Beisil Oimrim HaParish Min HaOrlo KaParish Min HaKever. Beisil say someone who separates from the Arlo, or somebody who gets a bris milah, is like someone who separates from a grave, just as a person who became tamei from a mace. cannot become tahar unless he gets spritzed with mechatos, which is ash from the paradum mixed with spring water on the 3rd and 7th days of his tumah. So too a ger must be sprinkled with this water on the 3rd and 7th day after his bris, before he can eat from a korban pesach. This is because of concern that he may have came in contact with a mace shortly before his gerus. A ger should really be able to eat from the korban right away after his gerus, even if he did touch a corpse before his conversion, since a non-Jew cannot become tameh. Beis Hillel, however, are concerned that if we will allow the convert to simply immerse himself in Erev Pesach and eat the korban pesach that night without first being spritzed with the mei chatos during the preceding week, he may think he can do the same thing the next year, even if he becomes tamei lameis during the week before Pesach. The next year, however, it would be awesome for him to do so because he's Yid and can become tamei. Therefore, according to Beis Hillel, we tell the ger not to be tevel in Erev Pesach, so he doesn't become a full-fledged ger, and thus he will not yet be obligated to bring the korban pesach yet. Now, would he have to bring a pesach sheni? L'choira, not.